Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr, and we devote our weekly hour here at the Black Table to discussing topics and personalities, events of interest to people of African descent, and to others, working together to build a better society. Well, we all have by now probably heard of the Deion Sanders effect. We have all probably by now heard the story of Deion Sanders, the former head football coach at Jackson State University and now head football coach at the University of Colorado. The story now has been everywhere. It's been done to death. September 21st, which was one of his old football numbers. On the 21st of September 2020, Deion Sanders was hired at Jackson State, and he brought prime time to Mississippi. And we saw it all unfold. He's not the only coach to have been a professional athlete to serve at a HBCU. He's not the only coach in football. There is, of course, Eddie George at my alma mater, Tennessee State, Ed Reed, of course, at Bethune-Cookman, who made some interesting off-key remarks fairly recently. We'll probably be talking about that. There's Sean Gilbert at Livingstone, Tyrone Wheatley at Morgan State. I mean, either past, present coaches, and of course, Hugh Jackson at Grambling. Basketball, there are even more. Kenny Anderson at Fisk, Cynthia Cooper, who was at Texas Southern for a number of years, Juan Dixon at Coppin, and WNBA player Lauren Harper at Coppin as well. Lindsey Hunter, some of y'all remember him from Detroit Pistons. He's at Mississippi Valley State University. George Lynch, North Carolina fame at Clark Atlanta University, and the list goes on and on. Recently, of course, we've seen a huge splash at Fisk with the women's gymnastic team. Sister Corrine Tarver, who was the first Black woman to win an all-around event at the NC2As, leading that young team. And Talladega College has made noise of becoming the second HBCU gymnastics. I hope we talk about that with the two brothers we have today. We wanted to look at this Sanders effect as a point of entry for a larger conversation about Black institutions, about the purpose and function of HBCUs and some of the challenges. And for those of us who have worked at HBCUs and those of us who have had to make some difficult choices as whether to stay at HBCUs, the push-pull factors at HBCUs, we couldn't think of two better folk to invite back to the round table here. We have our HBCU Master Educators Round Table. And so we're inviting back to the Black table our brothers Jelani Favors, who is at North Carolina A&T, of course, in North Carolina, who is the Henry Fry Chair there, a historian, a brilliant scholar, a brother who has made a way in so many ways in a number of different institutions, white and Black, who has served at HBCUs and HWCUs, and of course, who we had a conversation with a while back on his very important book, Shelter in the Time of Storm, which is about the history and struggle and meaning of HBCUs. And we're also joined by our brother, Richard Benson. Dr. Benson is Associate Director with the Center of Urban Education, and he is an Associate Professor of the Black Radical Tradition in Education in the Department of Educational Foundations at, the Department of Educational Foundations, Organization and Policy at the University of Pittsburgh. So I didn't know Pittsburgh was the HBCU. It's not, but he served a long time on the faculty of Spelman College. And so we couldn't think of any two brothers better than folk who have worked at Black colleges, white colleges, who have made some difficult decisions at difficult moments. And if folk beat up Deion Sanders for leaving, we damn sure ain't gonna beat up Rich Benson for going to Pittsburgh. But we can get some insight, I think, on this Sanders effect from a different perspective. Welcome back to the Black Table, brothers.
What's going on, bro?
Man, Brother Greg, it's so good to see you. Jelani, I feel like you and I also go back before the Granite Crack as well. Good to see you, bro.
No doubt, man. It's a pleasure to be with both of y'all. And Greg, when you told me about the show, I was excited. When you told me that Rich Benson was going to be on the show, I was all in. That's my brother from another mother. Rich, it's great to see you, man. And glad to see you moving forward in your career, brother.
You as well, man.
In fact,
you as well.
I'm glad you said that, Jelani, because it gives me a chance to inject that among other things that Dr. Benson has contributed to this ongoing struggle, this intellectual warfare that Jacob Brothers talks about, is his brilliant book, Fighting for Our Place in the Sun. Amen. Malcolm X, Radicalization of the Black Student Movement, Malcolm X Liberation University. And so thinking about either of you, we can just toss this out to begin with. I don't know if any of you all have any thoughts about Deion Sanders and what did and didn't happen at Jackson State, particularly in the context of this ongoing struggle to really define what it means to be a Black university and what we can do in those spaces. Either of y'all, just jump on in.
So, Greg, one of the first things I actually thought about when he made the decision to to make the leap or transition over to Colorado, I just recall maybe about 6 months prior to him making the announcement, there was always this consistent conversation around the Big Five schools, and as to whether or not this is something that he was considering while he was at his time at Jackson State. And I remember his initial responses, and then I remember, and those responses being, they weren't necessarily within a conversation around him having already made a determination to move. He was weighing options, and then he eventually, he made the transition. But during that time, and this is, I for all seriousness, I don't want to take away from the moment, just for the sake of having just like a quip around being facetious. But I'm serious, y'all. The thing that kept coming up in my mind was the lawnmower.
How about that, brother? Tell us why. Now, if you worked at a black college, I can tell us why that lawnmower stuck in your mind, man.
2 words, y'all: invisible labor. Invisible labor. That's what I just kept thinking about. I said, anybody from the outside who has no familiarity will probably think to themselves, okay, well, the dedication wasn't there. He was able to use his space as a stepping stone to move on to this institution, et cetera. But the thing that he said with the lawnmower, it resonated with me. He said, I asked for a couple of things to be done in order for us to just be able to practice on a continuous basis, and in such a way that these young people will have access to the field and also the equipment and the ability to be able to do so without any type of impediments. However, when I asked for it to be done, I had to ask several times. And I said to myself, Deion Sanders said, and I'm paraphrasing, I wasn't going to wait for anybody to do what it is I asked them to do, knowing that I'm providing a service to the institution. So I just had those people drop off. I had my people drop off my lawnmower. And I cut the grass myself. And then with that, I said to myself, well, how many times have I tried to appeal to a higher sensibility at the institution that I was at, but I felt like it fell on deaf ears. And then for the work that I would do, scholarship that I was able to produce. I mean, hell, Jelani and I, we talked about it extensively just in terms of the book that he was able to put out. Then I told Jelani, I said, well, a lot of what it is that I was able to do, fortunately, and God bless, was not because of, but in spite of. So with that invisible labor, that's like those 2 words continue to pop into my mind, because I wondered about all of what it is that he had to do in order to work through processes as a coach to be successful in spite of, not because of.
Absolutely. Jelani, I remember we met years ago, man, down at John Hope Franklin Center at Duke. You were in residence there working on what eventually became Shelter in the Time of Storm. But like Dr. Benson said, just like Rich said, you spent a great number of those years crafting that book, working at Morgan State. And none of the 3 of us are research faculty. No, we teach in full loads, brother. So any thoughts about what Rich just said in terms of this invisible labor? That's a powerful notion.
Yeah, without question. One, I wanted to also point out the fact that North Carolina A&T State University, my alma mater and my current place of employment, just hired Vince Brown, who is also a former pro, played for the New England Patriots. So you didn't shout him out there in your comments. I just want to shout out Coach Brown, who's just now coming to A&T. And he is replacing Coach Sam Washington, who also played for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So there's this long legacy and history, as you outlined, of former NFL players who've returned to HBCUs. Many of them were products of HBCUs, as was Coach Brown and Coach Sam Washington.
Well, maybe because y'all are traitors, man. Just like my alma mater is traitors. Y'all left the Negro League and went to the Colonial Athletic and Tennessee State. I was student body president. We fought like hell not to go into the OVC. We should probably get into that too, because then Deion makes some noise about taking Jackson State out of the SWAC.
Right.
So, but go ahead though, Jelani. We in this first open up and then we can see at the break.
I mean, the labor is real, but also the commitment has to be real. And the legacy of what HBCUs have done with less. And when we say less, we don't say that in a romanticized way. We say that in the sense that these are institutions that have been systemically underfunded, since their inceptions, deliberately underfunded. since their inceptions, and to work within these spaces, to use a sports metaphor, we've always punched above our weight. And I think that when you look at someone like Deion, or even some, honestly, when you said we were going to have this conversation, I said, oh man, it has been kind of beat to death. And then here comes Ed Reed. Just this past week, Ed Reed wants to weigh in, and
invisible labor though. He's mad about that trash. That's what the point is.
Yeah, he's upset about the trash in his office and the conditions on campus, and he made a public spat about it. But there has to be contextualization, and I think that's what's lost sometimes within these spaces, these social media spaces that we crafted. Is that we get these sound bites, we get these short clips. Everybody has a hot take, and you can deliver those hot takes without historical contextualization, and your audience is lost within the sauce. They don't get to know the whole story, the full breadth of what it means to work at these institutions and the struggles that have often defined their growth or lack thereof. And I think that both Deion and I think clearly Ed Reed missed the opportunity to highlight, yes, you're bringing things to the table, you're having to do things on your own, but let's talk about why sometimes that's the case. Even since I've been in North Carolina A&T, an institution which is one of the more better off, if you will, HBCUs in terms of resources, I've had to pull from my own. I want to take my students down to the Civil Rights Museum, which also, of course, was where the Woolworths was on February 1st, 1960, where A&T students launched a social revolution. I wanted to take my students down there, and we didn't have transportation to get it done. In order to get my students there. So I leaned upon community resources that I knew to make sure that my students got there. Now that was out of bounds for me, and A&T had to slap me on my hand, but I knew that, hey, if I'm gonna talk about the legacy of student activism at HBCUs, there's no better place to do that than to go to that particular venue. But I say all that to say that we're still looking at institutions in 2023 that have incredible, prodigious challenges as it relates to resources or lack thereof. And we need people who can properly contextualize that, who are historically aware of that, and can hopefully help us find remedies to addressing those type of issues.
Well, let's come back on the other side of the break and continue that conversation, particularly about having to have those type of people at our schools and advocating for our schools. And we'll be back in a moment here at the Black Table with Professors Jelani Favors and Professor Rich Benson. We'll be back in a moment.
Black Star Network is here.
Oh, no punches!
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home. You dig?
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. We're discussing HBCUs and the Sanders effect. And as you see, we've gone past Deion Sanders fairly quickly to get right into these issues. When we broke, Jelani, you were really helping us understand some of the ways that we have to kind of work around some of the institutional challenges we have. And Rich, as you were talking, I was thinking about Ed Temple at Tennessee State, who was picking rocks out of the track and then produced all these Olympic sprinters and runners without a full working functional track. And of course, that's not unusual at HBCUs for that era. Jelani, you were talking about this constant underfunding. Could you say something just quickly about what just happened to A&T in terms of North Carolina punishing A&T for having too many out-of-state students? I know Tennessee State just got millions of dollars from the legislature for remedial work, but they constricted it to only certain buildings that could be improved. Could you talk a little bit about how these oppressive things operate, particularly with public HBCUs, some of the things that didn't get covered, as Deion Sanders was talking about the things that weren't happening at Jackson State?
Well, first, let me lead off by saying this. I'm really proud of North Carolina A&T State University. This year, for the last few years, we've had a community and text book that the entire campus is reading in order to shape public discussion and discourse on a certain theme. This year, the book that we have assigned to our students and to our campus community is Adam Harris's brilliant book, The State Must Provide. If you haven't picked that up, I strongly encourage your viewers to read Adam's book because it highlights his legacy of inequity, of underfunding, and it provides proper historical contextualization about the struggles that Black colleges are confronting. So when you look at what's going on.
Before we should mention before that he went to A&M, didn't he? He's an Alabama A&M grad.
Yeah, he's an Alabama A&M grad, absolutely.
A&M or State? I'm trying to remember.
Alabama A&M.
A&M, okay.
You can't mess that up.
No, I ain't gonna mess it up, man. But I'm just saying that because, of course, people would know him, if at all, for writing for The Atlantic, but he's an HBCU grad, as you say, so that's what the mission. But go ahead.
Play sports there. Play basketball at Alabama.
Absolutely.
No, I was going to say to that point that you're saying about the North Carolina legislature, sort of slapping A&T on their hand in order to try to expand resources by bringing in out-of-state students and therefore punishing us for overseeing that cap. It looks ridiculous. It is ridiculous for an institution which just over the last 30, 40 years has been proven and documented through the work of Adam, as well as the article that came out in Forbes, that we've been shorted. I shouldn't even use the word shorted. We've been robbed of close to $4 billion with a B. I think Florida A&M was second behind us. Theirs is like $2 billion, almost $3 billion. So again, the idea notion that someone would try to come around and suggest that A&T is somehow not living up to the protocols that have been set forth by the state in terms of in-state students versus out-of-state students. Black colleges are simply trying to survive, and the idea that they want to punish us because A&T right now is riding a public high, and students are more interested than ever in enrolling at the institution, both in-state as well as out-of-state. It's criminal. Let's be honest with you. And so I'm excited about the conversation that Adam's book is bringing to A&T, because I think that it's time to awaken these sleeping giants. I'm so proud of what Florida A&M University is doing. Their students have launched out and said, hey, it's time for us to bring suit against Florida A&M. I'm also proud that Florida A&M, their freshman class for the last 2 years, have been reading Shelter in a Time of Storm. So I think it's important that history matters. That they understand the legacies from which they represent, and they understand the shortcomings that we see across campus. Every year at the beginning of fall, we see students upset about the lack of infrastructure, the lack of beds that are available. They take to social media to complain about it, whether it's at state institutions or whether it's at private institutions like Clark Atlanta or Spelman or Morehouse. I think it's time for students to sharpen and refocus that criticism to where it lies or should lie, and that is at the foot of the white supremacist political structure.
Absolutely. You raised something a minute ago, Jelani, before the break, and then led and continued here on this, I guess maybe resurgence of sorts of interest in HBCUs. Of course, we saw Deion Sanders, and next, ESPN is down there, and so on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And for a lot of people, it was a moment, or it was a revelation. Oh, this is HBCU. For our people, of course, many of us know about HBCUs, but then you talked about social media and you talked about technology. Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. I mean, as you write about, and as you lived, and as I lived, and so those of us in a certain generation, when we had student protests, and as you say, they're almost perennial at HBCUs, and it's usually about infrastructure, as you say. This is something that didn't capture a lot of attention beyond the schools, but with social media now, it happens immediately. Right. I mean, as we know, the Howard students, for the better part of a semester, occupied the student center, and the world knew about it because they were on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, everywhere else. This attention on HBCUs, this flash and sizzle, how do you see that translating into possibilities for us to push the envelope and to get some of those much needed resources?
Well, I honestly think that if our leaders, our campus leaders, are the visionaries that they are and should be, they should find ways to leverage that. They should find ways to say, yes, we have some infrastructure shortcomings. We have some issues as it relates to campus funding, the ability to bring in increasingly top-notch faculty to sponsor programs on campus. But again, that is not by happenstance. It's deliberate, it's systemic, and it's a reflection of this system. And if we can channel our students back into understanding that, the historical nature of that, and use their voices not simply to throw rocks internally at our administration. And don't get me wrong, leverage criticism where criticism is due. If indeed we have administrators who are insensitive to these demands and concerns, they need to be held accountable. But we can't afford to continue to have this conversation by not looking at the broader picture. And again, going back to Adam's book, I think that he reminds us that there is indeed a broader picture to understand and to appreciate as it relates to how and why these institutions have been crippled in the way that they have. It's not, as I said before, by happenstance. This is something which has been in the mix and in the making for more than 100 plus years.
Absolutely. And I'm also encouraged and don't want folks to pass lightly by the fact that there are some big read projects at HBCUs. You mentioned FAM there at A&T. At Howard, we've had in our freshman seminar, we've been doing that for a while. And, so it's very encouraging to hear as well. Rich, for years, man, on that faculty at Spelman, you had a front row seat to a very interesting disassembling of kind of a competitive intercollegiate athletic program and saying, no, we're not going to deal with this athletic competitions. We're going to do intramural sports. And we'll probably have to pick this back up on the other side of the break. But I'm wondering if you could open up maybe a little bit of a conversation about how coaches, particularly at HBCUs, often either serve as members of the faculty or are integrated into the faculty, maybe at least historically differently than they are at white schools, and what it might mean for us to start looking at HBCU coaches as celebrities and maybe those who might provide a stepping stone to this professional athletic complex that was never really the goal of HBCUs to begin with. Since Spelman dismantled its kind of athletic competition model for favor of an intramural model and a health and wellness model, any thoughts on how we should be thinking about athletics at HBCUs and how that differs from the Power 5 conferences, the SEC conferences, in terms of the nature of where athletics fits at HBCUs or doesn't fit?
Got you. And thank you for the question, because I think around my third or fourth year when I was at Spelman, based on this campaign around wellness as related to an overhaul and also building renovations and everything else around the kind of like this, I would say this infusion to push wellness as a part of the general college curriculum. We had a new building built, while at the same time eliminating the sports teams and programs that existed at the college, which many of the faculty actually thought was counterintuitive and also, a bit, I would say to some degree, maybe even hypocritical as related to what it is that the wellness campaign was speaking to versus what took place on the ground. So many of us thought it was a bottom line question, dealing with finances versus the issue or versus the target, which seemed to move as related to wellness. And for many of us, we understood, or I would say for many of those who have relationships with those in coaching or the coaching staff, et cetera, some of them obviously, just as any other HBCU, were attached to teach courses, whether it's in physical education or dealing with kinesiology, et cetera. So the staffing issue in question was something that arose. But then also, what does it look like in order for our young people who are building relationships with these coaches who have, I would say, have an intention to be able to ensure that the program is winning, but the resources are still a question. And then also, matters around how young people wanted to utilize athletics within this space. And in this case, obviously, I can only speak of Spelman at that particular time, but how they wanted to use athletics as related to them furthering some academic portion of their career, matriculation at Spelman College as well. These are issues that arose And to some degree, I think people felt like that it would be resolved by utilizing the wellness campaign as almost like a replacement for what it is that the athletics weren't going to be able to provide. But it didn't seem to pan out that way. And Greg, again, I only feel like I'm answering a part of the question or whatever.
No, that's good. I mean, in fact, let's pause here and come back on the other side of the break and continue this conversation, because I want to ask a very specific question to both of y'all as it relates to exactly what you just brought up, Rich. So we'll be back here at the Black Table with Richard Benson and Jelani Favors, our HBCU Master Educators Roundtable regular segment here at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
Don't you think it's time to get wealthy? I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show on the Black Star Network focuses on the things your financial advisor or bank isn't telling you. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table. Remember to support the Black Star Network. Download the app, join the Bring the Funk fan club. This is Black-owned media. And as you can see, these are conversations you're not going to see anywhere else. So we're back with our HBCU Master Teachers Roundtable. And Rich, you know, in walking us through what happened at Spelman, several thoughts came to mind. I want to just ask a very broad question, because this Fisk gymnastics team fascinates me, man, in terms of brand ambassadors. It seems it's very efficient. I mean, if you can get these young sisters coming to do athletics at HBCUs, it's not as cost prohibitive as the revenue bringers. Any thoughts from either of you on what should be the footprint of athletics at HBCUs in the contemporary era? How should we be thinking about athletics at HBCUs?
Well, let's be honest, right? In terms of 2023, and I think this has been the case for the last probably 40 years, and that is that sports has served as the front porch in terms of marketing in higher education. And that, of course, is in collusion with the rise of cable television, the rise of big sports contracts, and let's also be clear about this, is that the NCAA is $1 billion, and college athletics is $1 billion industry, which is largely predicated upon Black athletics, or the success of Black athletes in both football and basketball, which drive revenue for the NCAA. And this is talent, which again, 40, 50 years ago, almost exclusively were recruited by and attended Black colleges. You know, you were talking about this long legacy of the SWAC and MEAC and the CIAA. We are not new to this. We are absolutely true to this. And when you look at this rich tradition of producing Hall of Fame talent in all sports, you talked about the Tiger Bells. You could talk about people like Jake Gaither. You could talk about Grambling and Jackson State and Southern and Morgan State, who had also really rich history at North Carolina A&T, particularly in basketball, and Howard University. These are institutions which thrive for years. And so, but sadly, what we've seen, again, over the last particularly 40 or 50 years, that same talent has been seduced to move away from HBCUs into the far institutions which are far more flush with resources, with infrastructure, again, deliberately so. Racistly so, right? And you know, that's, I think, has been the unfortunate byproduct, is that these sports have helped to blossom and grow and expand these institutions, and it's largely been on the backs of Black athletes. And so I look at my own graduate alma. I went to grad school at The Ohio State university. Ohio State is like a little city unto itself. It's constantly building, constantly expanding. And yes, that's a reflection of alumni donations, but we would be a fool to think it's not also because Ohio State is in a BCS bowl game every year. And we're talking about millions and millions of dollars, which ultimately ends up translating into larger billions of dollars for these institutions. So Black colleges, I think, have to embrace sports as a form of marketing. But again, that's going to take a hard conversation about the lack of resources. I think this is the frustration and tension that we felt and saw for people like Deion Sanders and Ed Reed, who don't know anything about the history of these institutions and spaces, who came from, at least from their collegiate backgrounds, came from PWIs that were flush with resources, University of Miami, Florida State University. And so then you arrive on campus at Bethune-Cookman or at Jackson State, and you see crumbling infrastructure. It looks like two completely different worlds. And guess what it is? But unless you're able to, again, historically contextualize that, be empathetic about that, and more importantly, drive to close that gap, then what service are you really bringing to the university?
That's a great question, brother. In fact, Rich, as Jelani was talking, I thought about the choices that all of us who are faculty have to make every day. When you talked about invisible labor, faculty at HBCUs, one of the things that I hope we could explore a little bit is some of the challenging decisions that faculty make because of these push-pull factors when they want to do their work, they want to be of service to our communities, and yet and still sometimes we have to make some painful decisions. I'm sure you just made one. And I thought, we see Deion Sanders getting beat up, but in fact, the choice that Rich Benson made to go to the University of Pittsburgh isn't because of any lack of fidelity to the race. We have to face the material reality that we want to go where and be where we can do the best work for our people. I don't know if you have any thoughts about some of the ways we have to make those decisions.
Jelani, thanks for everything that you actually made mention of. And I think, in all fairness, without question, we're still talking about a failure reconstruction legacy in which all HBCUs, for the most part, are subject to what we actually want to be able to say that's the realization deserves a low level or a hyper level of criticism, but I actually want to consider the micro in addition to the macro. I think a question of priorities always has to be presented and then also revisited. Just like we would do with any other infrastructure on campus, whether it's a predominantly white, minority serving HBCU, et cetera, there's something that folks check in for, in terms of looking at the state of condition on every area of campus. And we get it. There's not going to be a multi-million-dollar plan that can be activated at a moment's notice at an HBCU because historically the luxury is just not there, based on all things dealing with structural racism and exclusionary practices, which are extremely intentional. However, I want to speak to priorities as it relates to areas in which funding can easily or more easily and readily be available for areas, but the priority is not there based on how it is that in many cases HBCUs have been used as fiefdoms for this I would say this elite top-down administrative class and approach to how it is that they function. Absolutely. So if we're talking about spaces in which we can actually say that the top 10 to 12 HBCUs out of the 101 that exist benefited from the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor funding industrial complex that took place, within the past 3 years, in which you have this philanthropic just dump of bread, for white guilt. If that can take place, how is it that in many cases we can't have accounting for the monies that have come in such a way that we can actually say, well, we weren't able to do all of what it is that we wanted to do for this area, whether it's dealing with dorms, whether it's dealing with mold, whether it's dealing with an increase of faculty pay for persons who are not only conducting the labor that you can see that's on paper, but the invisible. But how is it that we can't get accounting for those monies that come in many cases for the HBCUs who did receive such resources? So that's a point of contention that I would also have, in addition to talking about the legacy, but also talking about the current priorities around what takes place in funding for HBCUs. And then that goes back, whether it's athletics, whether it's STEM, whether it's education, whether it's history, liberal arts, humanities, etc. That is always going to be one of my biggest questions and criticisms. As someone who served at one for 13 years, as you, Jelani, for an extended period of time, and Greg, I think you over the 20-year mark at Howard. Still one of my questions.
Yes, sir. Man, it's so funny, isn't it, brothers? When Deion Sanders brings that up, it's like, oh, well, what are you doing? And then, but we know very real, as you say, where's the money coming from? That whole Breonna Taylor, George Floyd dump, as you say. And I heard, Jelani, I heard you chuckle, man. I was laughing too. That money. It's like, now, where's the money? Where did it go? Where did it go? I mean, so, we only have a couple of minutes left this block, and then we're going to the fourth block. But I'm wondering, Jelani, if you have any thoughts about what we just heard Rich lay out in terms of this very real challenge that we've experienced during this period of COVID and the so-called racial reckoning and the kind of receding from that.
Well, also, I think it's very important to contextualize that point in terms of the impact and significance of the dump that emerged out of, we still got racial oppression going on. It's being caught on camera. Let's throw all the money at HBCUs. But even this money, I mean, some of these institutions were getting $10 million, $5 million. Those were the biggest donations they had ever received.
Good point, man.
Had ever received. And these are, I mean, there are boosters and supporters and corporate dollars that go to PWIs on a yearly basis that quadruple that, right? That double that. But the mere fact that HBCUs, it was a story that, this institution or a donor just gave A&T, $10 million or $5 million. That's not news at many PWIs. Again, who receive those type of resources on a yearly basis. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that we should not hold our institutions accountable for these resources, where they're being placed, where they're most needed. But I also think it's important to realize that HBCUs are still far, far behind the pace as it relates to how these dollars matter, how they can be stretched, because quite honestly, it's just not a massive, I don't think it's the massive infusion that we believe that it is in order to operate an institution of higher education in the 21st century. No question. Maybe just enough money to get in trouble. Right.
Enough money to start some stink. Well, let's hold out this fourth block. We're going to take this break, and when we come back, let's continue along this path and talk a little bit about the implications of what we've seen. And we also want to throw in, with the end of affirmative action on the horizon, how you all think that might affect our historically Black colleges. So back in a moment with Professors Richard Benson and Professor Jelani Favors here at the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Back in a moment.
When you talk about blackness and what happens in Black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
There's a lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us.
We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it. This is about covering us. Invest in Black-owned media. Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks. We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Y'all money makes this possible. Check some money orders. Go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland at RolandSMartin.com.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. We're grateful for all the support everyone has shown the Black Star Network. Please join the Bring the Funk fan club. Download the app and donate and continue to support and watch all of our shows. The network is growing and expanding. Some exciting things on the horizon for 2023. Well, we reached our final block, and it's interesting. Some of those donations and some of that money, some of that dump, as you say, was also accompanied by some things that were, I don't know whether we would consider it philanthropy or investment. As in they said in It's a Wonderful Life, Potter's not selling, Potter's buying. Because now, of course, Howard's got this jump logo all over everything. I'm saying that's not an act of charity. These Negroes is using the brand. You know what I'm saying? But this renewed interest, Deion Sanders spotlight, sure, and Ed Reed, all these pro coaches pro players coming to coach. We see affirmative actions getting ready to end.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if either of y'all have any thoughts about what that might mean for students coming to HBCUs. I know some of the schools, we're seeing students now applying to HBCUs who probably would not have applied in the previous couple of generations since the end of apartheid in this country, at least formal apartheid. And it's very interesting because some of those students, for them, and you made this point, actually, Rich, very interestingly, the kind of class structure among HBCUs.
Yeah. So
these parents saying, HBCU, nah, well, here are the 4 you can go to.
Yeah.
I ain't gonna name no names. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Out of the 101.
Right.
And we've been at these institutions. I mean, I'm an HBCU baby myself. My mother went to Tennessee State.
Yes,
I
sir.
recall going to Nashville every year for homecoming, and I was fully immersed in what it actually felt like to be within a Black space as a kid in grade school. And then as I got older, whatever, I just recall, especially coming out of Chicago, you have the feeder schools out of every major city based on, Black class stratification that in many cases can be a bit of an uncomfortable space, but in the spirit of E. Franklin Frazier, bourgeois spaces out of certain cities feed to whether it's Howard, whether it's Spelman, whether it's Morehouse, whether it's Florida A&M, whether it's
I should interject here, Rich, right quick, and tied to something you said earlier, Jelani. That's one of the reasons why, as you write, these caps were put in place in the South, because the public equivalent of it, man, I went to school with so many Negroes from Chicago at Tennessee State because of that point. And these white boys in the South was like, okay, we're going to put a cap on out-of-state students. They were targeting those influxes, but you're talking about a different category. You're talking about this upper crust thing. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to make that point because
no, it's cool. My only point in terms of talking about this is essentially just to say that within, so within the model, and obviously this is not anything that I would ever want to, even think someone to think that I'm comparing to a predominantly white institution, sure. Just the HBCUs themselves, but within these spaces, understanding what it actually looks like to not fall into the contemporary 21st century version of what neoliberalism may look like, given that, funding may come from a myriad of sources. Some are going to get a lot more than others, but when the funding does come, how it is that we prioritize what the monies are going to do for the community or the campus institution and those who are institutional citizens at these spaces who believe in the mission and the model and who work beyond what it is that they know that they should be working based on a position to ensure that the young people who are there get what they need in terms of intellectual resources and representation as well. So my gripe and contention is still that in many cases, even though the funds cannot compare to a UGA or an Emory, obviously, but for the funding that does come, how is it that we earmark funding to ensure that we can protect those students and faculty who are there to actually work within the mission to further the mission, beyond the fact that the resources are not as opulent as in other spaces?
Yes.
Quick thing, I have to add this. Y'all can edit it out if you want to. A little bit later, but I need to be clear
just by saying that, we're keeping it.
You already know.
It's peace. Do what it is that you have to do. So during the COVID moment, as places were getting furloughed all over the country. I mean, in high institutional spaces, predominantly white, minority serving HBCUs, et cetera, were getting furloughed all over the country. A few things became clear. Number one, that the faculty that I was with at Spelman College, who I have a high level of respect for, did not understand what it actually meant to be non-traditional employees within spaces that did not align to that of other persons who are staff who are more traditional orthodox in terms of pay. So folks didn't understand that we did not have vacation time or vacation days. They didn't understand that because they didn't understand within the academy that we're consistently working, whether it's on scholarship, teaching, et cetera, and it's a job that you just don't turn off. But then the second thing is they didn't understand that within academia, the general culture, that there was a consistent measure around presidents and staff at the executive level, whether they be in academic affairs or the president's side, presidential tier, the HBCU or this particular higher education, institution of higher education. Folks were taking pay cuts, but not in the form of furlough days. They were taking percentage cuts. That didn't happen where I was at Spelman College.
No, sir.
And the faculty had to ask as to whether or not that you actually going to take a percentage cut. And the response was disheartening and it was disrespectful. But the cut could have easily have been taken as our brother institution across the street with Morehouse, Clark, et cetera, as everybody else is taking a pay cut. I said to myself, well, if you're not going to take a percentage cut, but you're asking the faculty to take cuts in terms of furlough days, what is it that you're saying as relates to how it is that priorities are being placed in terms of this institution from the administrative level all the way down to the faculty? And then later on, then we had, which was and I'm going to put it in quotes, a protest, but not much of a protest because folks are too afraid to call it a protest around things that we needed within spaces as mold was being found, as the HVAC systems were going out, as students were complaining, et cetera, and not just at Spelman and other institutions as well. I said, okay, well, how are we prioritizing what it is that we do have? Without even necessarily thinking about what's not there, but what it is that we do have, and folks don't want to have that larger conversation. So that was a major point of contention that I have. And then as I speak to my friends, my colleagues, brothers and sisters at other HBCUs, and you hear the horror stories, it's like, okay, well, we're not going to have smart classrooms in every room, in every building, et cetera, because it's not the Ohio State. It's not University of Illinois. It's not UGA. We understand that. But for what we do have, there seems to be almost an intentional measure of just dismissiveness as relates to what could be done with the resources that are there. And that's always going to be my major point of contention at the micro level.
No, of course. And it's something we've all experienced. And I think everybody watching this who has been on an HBCU faculty can relate to exactly what you just said up to this moment. You know, Jelani, listening to Rich and thinking about the class issues that we have inside our HBCUs. And then again, thinking about Deion Sanders, thinking about those who played on his team, thinking about our student athletes in the revenue generating sports, think about their dreams and aspirations. Remember, like when in Jackson State's last games, they were singing the alma mater. I'm looking at Deion Sanders, and he got a look on his face like, I really don't want to go. But the boy wants to go to the league. I'm wondering, even in terms of the aspirations of some of the folk who are not the scholarship necessarily recruitees, not the ones who took the AP classes, but these young men and women who come to the HBCUs. Some of them are coached up and make it into the league. But this whole model and notion of class, even within the student body, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that as well, in terms of even what the Sanders effect might have been gesturing toward, that, you know, unearthed another painful truth about the nature of how we look at students, even in our student body.
Well, when you say the painful truth about how we look at our students, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, you know, the idea that if you're playing football at HBCU, are you looking at that student the same way, say, prior to the end of apartheid, you were looking at that student as a student first?
Right.
More.
Okay.
And now as somebody who might be like a black student at Ohio State, where we both were, where we know they're not even prioritizing their classroom experience. And then, you know, rhetoric aside at Jackson State, I'm wondering, you know, if that was the model that Sanders was gesturing toward. You're an athlete first and a student second. Rhetoric notwithstanding.
Well, I mean, just from Sanders' comments alone, because he made some comments, public comments. I think it came out in his press conference after his last game. Like you mentioned, it wasn't just the photos of him; it was his comments that really kind of reflected how much he appreciated the time that he has spent within this shelter. Right. And how it fed into not just his cultural sensibilities, but his identity as a young black man. And this is what we know. This is what HBCUs have done and continue to do, providing space to mentor, to mold, to pour into Black youth. Shedeur Sanders is an elite athlete who could have gotten a scholarship at any FBS institution, did receive scholarships at any FBS institution, and followed his father to Jackson State University. But beyond Shedeur Sanders, like you said, there are countless other athletes who don't have that same sort of elite status, who come and work. And I'm going to use your metaphor because I think that expands beyond just the athlete, but the students as well, is that we coach them up, right? In order for them to get into the game. And I think that Black colleges pour into athletes in the same way, at least I hope that many of my colleagues do, in the same way in which we pour into our students. I mean, Greg, you are probably one of the foremost celebrity HBCU scholars teaching at the Mecca. And you've had Nick Cannon in your class. You've had a number of other athletes. You get shot. And I think that people understand and reflect upon the fact that, hey, Greg Carr pours into me far differently than someone a professor would if I was at Georgetown or if I was at University of Maryland College Park or wherever, right? And I can't how many.
Let me pause here. Let me just interject here that what you all did at A&T for that young brother that used to play with LeBron James, that made me turn into somebody different, man. I was like, what the hell? I just wanted to mention that point because, I mean, when he started tweeting and he took that class, he started talking Black stuff about reading these books, saying he was miseducated. I'm like, what in the world is going on at A&T? That's a great example. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, but this is what we do, and so the space still matters. And I think it matters whether you are a student athlete or whether you are a scholarship student or you just hanging on by the seat of your pants. And I was in that latter group. I came to A&T not as a heralded student. I didn't have a strong GPA coming out of high school. But again, and I want to sound like a broken record, it's the space that matters. And that space, it invigorates, it inspires, and in the same way in which it transformed me into a mediocre student to what I am now, or an award-winning scholar. I mean, I wouldn't have been that had it not been for the presence and importance of Black institutions in my life. And so, I don't know if that answers your question to your point about athletes and regular students, but I think that I'm sure that when Shedeur Sanders' career is over, he's going to have far more fond memories of his time at Jackson State than he will at Colorado. And we'll see him at Jackson State's homecoming. And probably never again on Colorado's campus.
No question. Actually, that's a perfect place to close, Jelani. And I want to thank you and Rich for coming back to the Black Table and invite you back many, many more times. This is the kind of conversation we have to have, man. And honor and respect to both of you brothers, because
if I can real quick about Shedeur Sanders, when he comes back to JSU, bring the check with you.
Right. How about that? No question.
Bring the resources back.
That's right.
Yeah.
Greg, well, can I say one thing in closing?
Go ahead. Absolutely.
Long live Maroon Spaces, which HBCUs are, even for those who aren't even aware of what it is that we're doing beyond them now prioritizing, whether it's resources or truly investing in such ways to retain faculty, whether it's myself, whether it's you or whoever. Long live Maroon Spaces, which is the work that we've been able to do and the work that I continue to do, even though I'm not there. I just want to continue to be able to have, those constructive critiques in order to further these spaces, because they're still under assault. So I just want to add that in closing.
Absolutely. Thank you, brother. That's again Richard Benson from University of Pittsburgh, but also many HBCU experiences from the time he was a baby all the way up through to right now. And of course, our brother Jelani Fabius at North Carolina A&T. Thank you both for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. We're back in a moment to clear the table and start preparing for next week.
hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds.
As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol, we're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance.
We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
There's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. We really had a remarkable hour with Professors Richard Benson and Jelani Favors talking about not just the Deion Sanders effect, but what the Deion Sanders effect prompts and should prompt us to think about. As we think about our HBCUs, as we think about Black institutions, we realize that the dream, the vision of the Black university, the concept that really came to fruition in the 1960s, has yet to be realized. Today, we heard a great number of the reasons why that hasn't happened. But we realize that we continue to fight, we continue to struggle, and that as we continue to do the work in our Black spaces, our Black educational spaces, those who benefit, the students, represent the community. And that's the only reason these institutions exist. And when we lose sight of that, that's when we get lost. So we have to always remember that. So join us again next week here at the Black Table. We'll continue our conversation here on the Black Star Network. And thanks for your support. Tell a friend, tell a family member, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.